In a quiet little neighborhood surrounded by tall trees and rolling hills, there lived a man named Mark Thompson. To his neighbors, he was just another friendly face on the street, a guy who always waved hello and kept his yard tidy. But what many didn't know was that Mark had a secret mission. As a firefighter, he had seen firsthand how quickly wildfires could rage out of control, especially in dry areas like theirs. The thought of flames sweeping through their peaceful community haunted him, so he decided to take matters into his own hands. One day, a large delivery truck pulled up outside Mark's house. His curious neighbors peeked through their curtains as workers unloaded an enormous blue water tank from the back. It wasn't fancy or decorated. It was purely functional, designed to hold thousands of gallons of water. Mark parked it right in his driveway, where it stood like a silent guardian against potential disaster. Every week, he filled it up using a hose connected to his home's water supply. He even tested the pump regularly to make sure it worked perfectly when needed. At first, some neighbors chuckled about Mark's project. One joked that he was building a backyard swimming pool for himself. Another teased that maybe he planned to start a car wash business. But Mark didn't mind the jokes. In fact, he welcomed them because they gave him a chance to explain why the tank mattered. "This isn't just for me," he'd say with a serious look. "If a wildfire ever comes near us, this could save our homes, and maybe even lives." Despite his efforts to educate people, not everyone shared his enthusiasm. Some found the tank unattractive, complaining that it ruined the neat, uniform appearance of the neighborhood. A few grumbled that it looked more like industrial equipment than something meant to protect their families. Still, most folks shrugged it off, figuring it wasn't worth making a fuss over. After all, Mark seemed harmless enough, and nobody expected a wildfire to strike anytime soon. What Mark didn't realize, however, was that trouble was brewing behind the scenes. Their homeowners association, known as the HOA, prided itself on keeping the community looking picture perfect. There were strict rules about everything from lawn length to mailbox colors, and anything deemed unsightly was quickly flagged for removal. When the HOA board got wind of Mark's water tank, they weren't pleased. They argued that such a bulky structure violated their guidelines and sent notices reminding residents to keep their properties aesthetically pleasing. Mark remained blissfully unaware of these discussions. He went about his routine, checking the tank's levels and ensuring it was ready for action. Little did he know, the HOA was already planning its next move, and it would change everything. For now, though, life in the neighborhood carried on as usual. Kids played outside, dogs barked in the distance, and the sun set behind the trees, casting long shadows across Mark's driveway where the blue tank stood silently waiting, for better or worse. It was a bright, sunny afternoon when the trouble began. Mark had left his house early that day to run some errands, leaving the water tank standing proudly in his driveway. The neighborhood was quiet, just the usual hum of distant lawnmowers and the occasional chirp of birds. Unbeknownst to him, an HOA representative named Linda was making her rounds through the community, clipboard in hand, jotting down notes about overgrown hedges, chipped paint, and other minor infractions. When Linda reached Mark's house, she stopped abruptly. Her eyes narrowed as she stared at the massive blue tank dominating his driveway. She circled it slowly, tapping her pen against her notepad. To her, it wasn't just a piece of emergency equipment. It was an eyesore, a glaring violation of the HOA's strict aesthetic guidelines. After a few moments, she sighed and pulled out a pre-printed notice. Scribbling a quick note on it, she taped it firmly to the side of the tank before moving on to the next property. The note read, "Asterisk, this structure violates Article 7, Section 3 of our community guidelines regarding unsightly objects on residential properties. Please remove within 48 hours or face consequences." Asterisk, it sounded official, even intimidating, but it lacked any hint of understanding or flexibility. For Linda, this was just another routine task. She didn't pause to consider why someone might have such a large object in their driveway, or whether it served a greater purpose. Later that evening, Mark returned home to find the note fluttering gently in the breeze. At first, he thought it was a prank. Surely, the HOA couldn't be serious about removing something so important. He read the message again, his brow furrowing with confusion and frustration. How could they not see how vital the tank was? Shaking his head, he decided to take action immediately. Mark picked up the phone and dialed the HOA office number listed at the bottom of the notice. A receptionist answered, her tone polite but distant. "Hi, I'm Mark Thompson," he began. "I got a notice about my water tank today. I need to explain. It's for wildfire emergencies. It's here to help protect the entire neighborhood." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Finally, the receptionist replied, "I understand, Mr. Thompson, but the rules are very clear. All residents must comply with the guidelines to maintain property values. If you'd like to keep the tank, you'll need to seek special approval from the board." "Special approval?" Mark echoed, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't about aesthetics. It's about safety. What happens if a wildfire comes through here, and we don't have enough water?" "I'm sorry, sir," the receptionist said, her tone firm now. "Those are the rules. You'll need to address your concerns with the board directly." Frustrated but unwilling to give up, Mark spent the rest of the night drafting emails. He sent one to the HOA board, explaining in detail why the tank was necessary and offering to paint it or screen it off if appearance was truly their main concern. He also reached out to the local fire department, hoping they might back him up. Surely, someone would listen and intervene before things got worse. As he clicked send on the final email, Mark felt a flicker of hope, but also a growing sense of unease. The clock was ticking, and the HOA wasn't known for bending its rules. Deep down, he wondered if anyone would truly understand the stakes until it was too late. 2 days passed, and the neighborhood remained eerily quiet. Mark had spent those 48 hours anxiously waiting for a response from the HOA or the fire department. He checked his email constantly, hoping for some kind of reprieve. But no reply came. The only sounds outside were the rustling leaves in the wind and the occasional bark of a neighbor's dog. Still, he held onto a sliver of hope that cooler heads would prevail. Maybe someone on the HOA board would realize how unreasonable their demands were, or perhaps the fire department would step in and vouch for him. That hope vanished early on the morning of the deadline. Mark woke up to the soft glow of sunlight streaming through his bedroom window. As he sipped his coffee and glanced out the front window, something seemed off. His stomach dropped as he realized what was missing. The water tank, the one he'd worked so hard to set up and maintain, was gone. In its place was an empty space, glaring back at him like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. He rushed outside, heart pounding, dread creeping into every step. There, stapled to his gate, was a towing invoice. It read, *removal fee, $500, storage fee, $25/day. Below it was the name and contact information of the towing company responsible. Mark stared at the paper, his hands trembling with anger and disbelief. How could they do this, without even giving him a chance to explain further? Furious, Mark grabbed his phone and dialed the number listed on the invoice. A man answered after a few rings, his voice casual and unapologetic. "Toco Services," he said. "How can I help you?" "This is Mark Thompson," Mark began, struggling to keep his tone steady. "You towed my water tank from my driveway yesterday. What gives you the right to take it without warning me first?" "Oh, we had authorization," the man replied smoothly. "The HOA called us directly. They said it violated their rules, so we removed it." Mark's blood boiled. Authorization? That tank wasn't just some random piece of junk. It's emergency equipment meant to protect this entire neighborhood. Did anyone bother to ask why it was there before ripping it away? The man on the other end hesitated briefly, but quickly regained his composure. "Look, buddy, we're just doing our job. If you want your tank back, you'll need to pay the fees and storage costs. Otherwise, It stays where it is." Before Mark could respond, the line went dead. He clenched his fists, pacing back and forth in his driveway. This couldn't be happening. He thought about calling the HOA again, but deep down, he knew it wouldn't make a difference. These were the same people who cared more about matching flower pots than actual safety. Later that day, Mark decided to confront them directly. He drove to the HOA office, a small brick building tucked away in a corner of the subdivision. Inside, the air conditioning hummed softly as he approached the reception desk. Behind it sat a woman typing furiously on her computer. When she looked up, her expression shifted from neutral to slightly annoyed. "I'm here to speak with whoever authorized the removal of my water tank," Mark said firmly, laying the towing invoice on the counter. After a brief pause, the receptionist buzzed the HOA president, Mrs. Peterson, who emerged moments later. She was a tall, stern-looking woman in her late 50s, dressed impeccably in a tailored blouse and slacks, her lips pressed into a thin line as she regarded Mark. "Mr. Thompson," she said coolly, "we gave you fair warning. You chose to ignore our guidelines." "Ignored them?" Mark shot back, his voice rising despite his best efforts to stay calm. "I explained exactly why that tank was there. It's not decoration. It's a critical resource during emergencies. Wildfires could destroy this neighborhood, and you've just made us more vulnerable." Mrs. Peterson crossed her arms, unmoved by his plea. "Rules are rules, Mr. Thompson. If you wanted special treatment, you should have sought approval beforehand. We cannot allow individual residents to flout regulations based on personal opinions." Mark stared at her, incredulous. Personal opinions. Was protecting lives really just a matter of opinion now? He opened his mouth to argue further, but stopped himself. There was no point. No amount of reasoning seemed capable of breaking through the wall of bureaucracy standing between him and common sense. As he walked out of the office, defeat weighing heavily on his shoulders, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that disaster loomed closer than ever. The HOA had won this battle. But at what cost? Word of the water tank's removal spread like wildfire. Ironically enough, through the neighborhood. By the time Mark returned home from his frustrating encounter with the HOA, several neighbors had already heard about what happened. Some came by to offer support, shaking their heads in disbelief at the HOA's decision. Others whispered behind closed doors, torn between siding with Mark or sticking to the status quo. The once peaceful community was now buzzing with tension, divided over whether the HOA had gone too far. The turning point came during the next neighborhood meeting, held in the cozy but cramped HOA clubhouse. Normally, these gatherings were dull affairs where residents discussed mundane topics like holiday decorations and speed bumps. But this time, the room was packed to capacity, with people spilling out into the hallway. Emotions ran high as everyone waited for the discussion to begin. When Mrs. Peterson, the HOA president, took her place at the front of the room, she tried to maintain an air of authority. Clutching a folder filled with notes, she cleared her throat and addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for coming tonight," she began, her voice clipped and formal. "As many of you know, we recently enforced our guidelines regarding unsightly objects on residential properties. This includes Mr. Thompson's water tank, which violated Article 7, Section 3. Before she could continue, murmurs erupted throughout the room. Mark sat near the back, arms crossed, watching silently as his neighbors reacted. Finally, unable to stay quiet any longer, he stood up. Every eye turned toward him as he stepped into the aisle. "I didn't buy that tank because I thought it looked good," Mark said, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I bought it to save lives. Wildfires aren't just something you see on TV. They're real, and they're dangerous. If one hits here, we'll need every resource we can get. And now, because of your rules, we're less prepared than ever." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. For a moment, there was silence. Then, a woman named Sarah spoke up. She lived 2 houses down from Mark and had always admired his dedication to safety. "He's right," she said firmly. That tank wasn't hurting anyone. It might not have matched the paint color of my shutters, but I'd trade a little ugliness for peace of mind any day. Others nodded in agreement, emboldened by her courage. A man named Greg added, "We pay dues to the HOA to protect our property values, sure. But shouldn't protecting our actual * properties * come first? What's the point of having pretty lawns if they burn down?" Not everyone agreed, though. An older couple seated near the front exchanged skeptical glances before the husband chimed in. "Look, I understand the concern," he said cautiously. "But rules exist for a reason. If we start making exceptions for everything, where does it end? Next thing you know, people will be parking tractors in their driveways or piling sandbags everywhere." This sparked a heated debate. Voices rose, tempers flared, and accusations flew across the room. On one side were those who believed the HOA had prioritized appearances over practicality. On the other were those who feared losing control of the neighborhood's carefully curated image. Through it all, Mrs. Peterson tried to regain order, banging her gavel against the podium repeatedly. "Enough," she finally shouted, her patience wearing thin. Turning to Mark, she said sharply, "If you wanted special treatment, you should have sought approval first. Instead, you chose to defy the rules. We cannot run a community this way." Mark met her gaze without flinching. "Special treatment," he repeated, his tone incredulous. "You call saving lives special treatment? Maybe it's time we rethink what really matters around here." The argument ended with no resolution. As the meeting adjourned, the divide among residents felt deeper than ever. Some walked away feeling vindicated, while others simmered with resentment. Mark left the clubhouse exhausted but resolute. He knew the battle wasn't over, not by a long shot, but as he glanced at the faces of his neighbors, he realized something important. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Whether they liked it or not, the HOA's actions had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about priorities, safety, and the true meaning of community. Less than a week after the heated neighborhood meeting, disaster struck in a way no one could have anticipated. It started with a distant wildfire that had been burning for days in a remote forest area several miles away. The news reports described it as contained and under control, but nature has a way of defying human predictions. Strong winds swept through the region overnight, carrying glowing embers far beyond the fire's original boundaries. By morning, those tiny sparks had ignited dry brush near Mark's neighborhood, creeping closer with terrifying speed. At first, the signs were subtle, a faint smell of smoke in the air, an orange haze tinting the horizon. But soon, the crackling roar of flames became impossible to ignore. Panic set in as residents scrambled to evacuate, grabbing whatever they could carry before fleeing their homes. Cars lined the streets bumper to bumper, horns blaring as people tried to navigate narrow roads choked with traffic. Firefighters arrived quickly, their trucks barreling into the subdivision with sirens wailing. They worked tirelessly to contain the blaze, spraying water onto rooftops and cutting back trees to create fire breaks. But their efforts were hampered almost immediately. They simply didn't have enough water. Hydrants ran dry, and tanker trucks struggled to keep up with demand. Every second counted, and precious time was wasted driving back and forth to refill supplies. As the chaos unfolded, Mark stood helplessly on the edge of the evacuation zone, watching his worst fears become reality. He thought about the confiscated water tank sitting unused in a storage lot somewhere. If only it had been there when it mattered most, firefighters could have had a fighting chance. Instead, house after house succumbed to the relentless flames, including Mark's own. The structure he poured so much effort into protecting was reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. The HOA clubhouse, however, remained untouched. Its pristine white walls and manicured landscaping survived unscathed, standing like a cruel symbol of misplaced priorities. As Mark watched the destruction unfold, he felt a mix of grief and anger, not just for himself, but for everyone who had lost so much. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very organization obsessed with maintaining appearances had failed to safeguard what truly mattered. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, the toll was devastating. Entire blocks lay in ruins, charred skeletons of homes marking where families once lived. The aftermath left the community reeling, not just from the physical damage, but from the emotional scars that would take years to heal. In the days that followed, outrage erupted among survivors. Many pointed fingers directly at the HOA, accusing them of negligence and short-sightedness. Social media buzzed with posts calling out the board's decision to remove the water tank. Local news outlets picked up the story, interviewing residents and broadcasting images of the devastation. Reporters asked tough questions. How could anyone prioritize aesthetics over safety? Why hadn't the HOA listened when Mark warned them? The pressure mounted until it became too much for the HOA leadership to bear. Mrs. Peterson, the president, resigned abruptly, citing personal reasons, though everyone knew better. Other board members faced blistering criticism during emergency meetings, with homeowners demanding accountability and reform. Lawsuits were filed against the HOA by those who had lost everything, alleging gross negligence and reckless disregard for public safety. Amidst the turmoil, Mark found himself thrust into an unexpected role, that of advocate and voice of reason. Despite losing his home, he refused to let bitterness consume him. Instead, he channeled his energy into educating others about the importance of preparation and resilience. He spoke passionately at town halls, urging communities to learn from the tragedy. "We can't change what happened," he told the packed auditorium one evening, his voice steady despite the weight of his words. "But we can make sure it never happens again. Rules are important, yes, but not if they blind us to the bigger picture. Let's honor what we've lost by doing better next time." His message resonated deeply, sparking conversations about balancing beauty with practicality. Slowly but surely, the seeds of change began to take root, not just in Mark's neighborhood, but in communities far beyond. In the weeks following the wildfire, the neighborhood began to pick up the pieces, literally and figuratively. The once pristine streets were now lined with piles of charred debris, twisted metal, broken furniture, and remnants of lives that had been turned upside down. For many residents, the emotional scars ran deeper than the physical damage. Conversations between neighbors often carried a heavy undertone of grief, frustration, and regret. But amid the sorrow, there was also determination, a collective resolve to rebuild stronger, smarter, and more united than before. The HOA, now under intense scrutiny, found itself at the center of a storm it couldn't ignore. Former board members faced harsh criticism not only from their neighbors, but also from local officials and media outlets. One by one, they stepped down, leaving behind a leadership vacuum. A new board was elected, this time composed of individuals who understood the importance of balancing aesthetics with practicality. Among them was Sarah, the neighbor who had defended Mark during the heated meeting. Her first order of business: overhauling the HOA's guidelines to prioritize safety over superficial appearances. The revised rules included provisions for emergency equipment like water tanks, generators, and defensible spaces around homes. Residents were encouraged, not penalized, for taking proactive steps to protect themselves and their community. To ensure compliance didn't come at the cost of beauty, the HOA even offered resources to help homeowners camouflage utilitarian items. Water tanks could be painted or screened. Generators could be housed in decorative enclosures. It was a compromise that acknowledged both sides of the issue while keeping the focus firmly on preparedness. As part of the healing process, the community came together to create a memorial garden near the entrance of the subdivision. Designed by a local artist, the space featured a winding path lined with native plants and benches where people could sit and reflect. At its heart stood a plaque engraved with the names of those who had lost their homes, and a tribute to the lessons learned. The inscription read, "Asterisk in memory of what we lost, and in gratitude for what we've gained. Resilience, unity, and wisdom." Asterisk. For Mark, life after the fire was bittersweet. He received an outpouring of support from neighbors, many of whom apologized for not standing by him sooner. Some even admitted they felt guilty for dismissing his warnings about the tank. "You tried to protect us," one woman said tearfully as she hugged him at a community gathering. "We should have listened." Though he appreciated the kind words, Mark knew dwelling on blame wouldn't change anything. Instead, he focused on rebuilding, not just his home, but his spirit. With insurance money and donations from well-wishers, he purchased a plot of land farther away from the subdivision, closer to nature, and free from restrictive HOA rules. His new house was modest but sturdy, designed with wildfires in mind. Fire-resistant materials, wide clearances, and multiple evacuation routes made it a model of safety. Outside his garage sat not one but two water tanks, gleaming in the sunlight. They were connected to a state-of-the-art pump system capable of dousing flames quickly and efficiently. Neighbors driving by sometimes teased him about going overboard with his preparations. "Planning to start your own fire department?" One joked during a casual chat. Mark chuckled good-naturedly, replying, "Better safe than sorry, right?" Despite everything he'd been through, Mark never lost sight of his mission. He continued speaking at events, sharing his story with anyone willing to listen. He partnered with local fire departments to host workshops on wildfire readiness, teaching people how to fortify their homes and create emergency plans. His message was simple yet powerful: preparation saves lives. The neighborhood, too, began to feel different. Gone were the days when disputes over mailbox colors dominated conversations. Now, discussions revolved around shared goals: how to make the community safer, more resilient, and more compassionate. Slowly but surely, the scars of the past gave way to hope for the future. And though the road ahead would be long, everyone agreed on one thing: they were stronger together. Months after the wildfire, the neighborhood began to transform in ways no one could have predicted. The rebuilding process wasn't just about constructing new homes. It was about creating a stronger, more thoughtful community. Foundations were laid, walls went up, and roofs took shape, but the real change happened in the hearts and minds of the people who called this place home. The memorial garden near the entrance became a cherished gathering spot. Families visited it on weekends, bringing flowers or simply sitting quietly as they reflected on what they'd lost and what they'd gained. Children played tag along the winding paths, their laughter mingling with the rustle of leaves. The plaque at the center served as a constant reminder of the lessons learned, that beauty and functionality could coexist, and that safety should never take a backseat to appearances. Inside the newly rebuilt homes, residents made subtle but meaningful changes. Fire-resistant siding replaced wooden panels. Gutters were fitted with guards to prevent debris buildup. Emergency kits sat ready in closets, stocked with supplies for any disaster. Even the HOA's revised guidelines encouraged these precautions, rewarding homeowners who took steps to protect themselves and their neighbors. It was a shift from rigid rules to practical solutions, and everyone felt the difference. Mark's influence rippled far beyond his own property line. His advocacy work inspired others to think critically about their surroundings. Neighbors started sharing tips on fireproofing techniques, swapping stories about affordable upgrades and creative designs. Some even followed his lead, installing water tanks or setting up defensible spaces around their homes. What had once been seen as an eyesore was now celebrated as a symbol of preparedness. Though Mark lived farther away now, he remained deeply connected to the community he'd fought so hard to protect. He attended town hall meetings when invited, offering advice based on his experience as both a firefighter and a homeowner. His presence always brought comfort. It reminded people that resilience wasn't just about surviving disasters. It was about thriving despite them. One crisp autumn afternoon, the neighborhood held a special event to celebrate its renewal. Tables laden with food stretched across the park, and colorful banners fluttered in the breeze. Kids raced around with balloons while adults chatted over cups of hot cider. At the heart of the festivities stood Mark, surrounded by smiling faces. Someone handed him a microphone, and the crowd grew quiet. I never wanted to be the guy who said, "I told you so," he began, earning a few chuckles. But if there's one thing I hope we've all learned, it's that preparation matters. None of us can predict when disaster will strike, but we can control how we respond. And today, I see a community that's not only rebuilt but reimagined. His words struck a chord, drawing nods and murmurs of agreement. When he finished speaking, applause erupted, echoing through the trees. For the first time in months, the air felt lighter, filled with optimism instead of fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light over the neighborhood, Mark stood back and watched the celebration unfold. He thought about everything that had led to this moment: the frustration, the loss, the hard-won victories. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The scars of the past would always remain, but they didn't define the community anymore. Instead, they fueled its determination to move forward. That night, as Mark drove home to his new house, he glanced at the two gleaming water tanks outside his garage. They weren't just tools for emergencies. They were symbols of hope, reminders that even in the face of uncertainty, people could come together to create something better. And as he stepped inside, closing the door behind him, he smiled softly, knowing the future looked brighter than ever. For himself, for his neighbors, and for communities everywhere willing to learn from the past.